Good evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Series. Tonight we are very pleased to have Jan Brogan here to talk about her book, The Combat Zone: Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice. Jan Brogan is a journalist and a novelist. A former staff writer for the Providence Journal and the Worcester Telegram, Brogan won the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Financial Writing. She worked for 10 years as a correspondent at the Boston Globe, and her freelance work has appeared in the Boston Magazine, the Improv Bostonian, Ladies' Home Journal, and Forbes. Brogan is also the author of 4 murder mysteries, one of which, A Confidential Source, was developed into a television series for HBO. She lives outside Boston and on Martha's Vineyard with her husband. Before we begin, please mute your electronic devices. Copies of the book can be ordered through our local independent bookseller Trident Books with free media mail shipping using the code BPLSHIP. Thanks for coming and enjoy the lecture.
I just want to make sure everybody can hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. First, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the library for hosting me. I want to thank Diane for that introduction. And I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Next month will be the 45th anniversary of the Puopolo murder in Boston's old combat zone. It was the most publicized murder of the 1970s, not always for the right reasons. Most of it initially was so publicized because of the outrage over the combat zone at the time. Later it became about race. I didn't set out to write about race. I set out to write about the injustice that Andy Puopolo did not get. But, and I still don't think he got the proper justice, but in researching this era, I learned about the many victims, many black victims that didn't get justice in this particular era. And now I've started to wonder what justice is for a murder victim, because the damage goes so far beyond. I mean, obviously a life is snuffed out, but the ramifications just go on forever for a family, for friends, and the grief is very different from regular grief. So I don't know what justice is, and maybe you guys will be able to tell me later what you think. So I'm going to read very briefly from the beginning of the book, just to set the stage. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the events, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So, the combat zone. The night began at Harvard, the Harvard Club, as you can see. So, on a cold night in November 1976, at the end of an up-and-down season, the varsity football team gathered at the Harvard Club in accordance with tradition. Under crystal chandeliers, the students dined on roast beef and green beans as they listened to speeches about brotherhood and accepted awards for their accomplishments. Princeton Heisman Trophy winner Dick Kazmaier gave the principal address. Robert F. Kennedy's widow, Ethel, made a special trip to present an award in honor of her husband. But the more powerful speeches came from inside the team, from coaches and the captain, who talked about the special bonds formed over double sessions, bus travel, and games that did not go as planned. Everything about Harvard football was steeped in tradition, from the century-old rivalry with Yale to the little flag waved each time the Crimson scored. It reminded the boys of the storied history of Ivy League football and the privilege of playing for Harvard. Andy Puopolo, one of the seniors who had hung up his shoulder pads for the last time, ate roast beef and sipped a Coke. He'd been pulled from Saturday's game against Yale with a mild concussion and had to be careful about how much alcohol he drank. It didn't matter. According to his friends and family, he was not usually much of a drinker. He had dark hair that fell below his ears in the overgrown mop style of the 70s, and green eyes often described as intense. Although relatively short for a football player at 5'10", he was muscular from long hours in the gym. Originally scoffed at by the Harvard interviewer when he said he wanted to play football, he'd worked hard to bulk up and had fought through injuries to win a starting position. But now his playing days were over and he was looking towards the future. After the game loss on Saturday, he had surprised his parents by announcing he'd received his first acceptance to medical school. Andy had had his share of glory, 2 interceptions in the game against UPenn and a mention in the New York Times. But it had been a disappointing season for the team. Picked as the favorite to win the Ivy League championship, Harvard had ended up not just behind the 2 co-champions, Yale and Brown, but tied with Dartmouth for second place. After dinner, the students went downstairs to the vaulted ceiling and dark Tudor wainscoting of the lounge. They milled around, drinking draft beer and bantering as they watched the highlight reels. By the end of the official Harvard banquet, they were ready to shake off defeat. So as was the tradition, the Harvard ritual to finish this night with a trip to the combat zone. And that seemed, and the combat zone, as you'll soon find out, was just incredibly crime-ridden at the time. And if that seems like a strange ritual for Harvard, it was actually a ritual for all of the university football teams, or many of them. And at BC, they called it force night, meaning you went there in force because you needed a lot of people to be safe. So a week before this night, the police commissioner, Robert DeGrazia, had released a nearly 600-page special investigation unit report detailing both the crime and how corrupt his own police force was. And the corruption was centered in the combat zone and District 1. This was the era when the North End was the center for the mob, so there was obviously a lot of corruption there too. But in the combat zone, a couple things, if you went on a Saturday night to the combat zone in its heyday, there would be 60 prostitutes clogged in front of Good Time Charlie's and on LaGrange Street, where the Liberty Tree, the Liberty Tree statue is. That would be all prostitutes. They would, sex acts would sometimes be inside the clubs. One club figured out a way to allow people to charge on a credit card, and they would be in alleys. Traffic would be stopped at a gridlock as women solicited through the window of stopped cars. Drugs were sold on the street and through car windows. And at this time, Robert Grazia estimated to me, I interviewed him shortly before he passed away, that at least 50% of cops were on the take. Many of them were drinking in the bars, on duty and off, and they turned their head to violations. One of the things he said to me was he had been recruited to come in and clean up the corruption, but when he got here, he just was floored by the extent of it. He said that he thought it was the most corrupt in the nation, and that what sickened him the most was how little it cost to buy off somebody. And part of this is Boston, and this is hard to remember now in this incredibly affluent city, Boston was really poor in those days. Boston had 20% unemployment in the black neighborhoods, 15% in the white neighborhoods. This was the era when New York was about to go bankrupt, and Boston was also hanging on by a thread. And in the combat zone, remember, people are buying drugs and sex, so they've got a lot of cash, right? They got thick wallets. So when they leave inebriated from the strip clubs or the topless bars, they get rolled. They get rolled or they get pickpocketed. And one of the things that this report illuminates a week before the Puopolo murder is that one of the big problems is what they called robber whore pickpockets. And these were women dressed as prostitutes who may or may not have actually been prostitutes. That's unclear to me. But they would sidle up to the men. They were usually very young. They would sidle up to the men, leaving the bars, kind of fondle them to distract them and steal their wallets. This report details that there's a new wrinkle to it, that now these pickpockets have protectors, men who come in and offer their protection in case a victim figures it out and gets angry for a cut of the wallet. So that's in the report, and Robert DeGrazia also told me he thought some of the cops did that as well. They offered protection for a cut of the wallet. So this is the era. The good thing about researching the 1970s is it makes you feel so much better about now. I mean, you forget how bad it was. You always think that the time you're living in is the worst, but it was really awful. So, all right, so the Harvard ritual was to come down to the combat zone. And they came, 40 to 50 of them, they estimate. And they went to a private show at the Old Naked Eye. And the Naked Eye was, they had a back room, so they had a private room in the back. Somebody on the team was related to the manager. And they stayed there till about 2 o'clock, closing time, and then they left. The problems did not start until they left the club. And this is where it used to be. Well, this is where it used to be. All right, so the fight started at Boylston and Tremont. And what happened was a group of about 8 Harvard football players was walking past the Carnival Lounge, and 2 women dressed as prostitutes started talking to them. And I just want to clear up something. Andy Puopolo was not in this group. It's so often reported that he got killed chasing prostitutes. I don't think he even saw the prostitutes on the street that night. He was in a completely different group. So they're leaving, they go past the Carnival Lounge, and one of them is drunk, and he starts, some of them say, don't talk to them. But one of them is drunk, and he talks about the $50 in his wallet and how he'd like to bring them back to the frat. And they follow them, or they end up back at the Harvard van, which is parked in a parking lot. And one of the prostitutes is inside they say for about 5 minutes. She leaves, the wallet's gone. And they go and they chase her. So there's a couple different chases, but one prostitute ends up here, and she drops, let's see if I have she drops in the middle of the street, probably just on the right-hand side. She drops to the street. The Harvard football players catch up to her. The first one who picks her up, who reaches her, helps her up, and says, "Do you have the wallet?" And she says no, and he lets her go. But at that time, 3 black men have come, and one of them has he tackles the lead Harvard football player, and by the time they get up, there are like 8 more Harvard football players. I guess the other 2 guys weren't there yet, and so they wind up surrounding him. Eddie Soares, he's kind of got his back to the T station, and they form a ring around him. And Eddie Soares, by his own testimony, was pretty much drunk out of his mind. He had just come from the Carnival Lounge where he said he had 9 drinks. And so there are actually no fists exchanged. They're surrounding him, and he's doing kind of kung fu moves and karate kicks. But I think the biggest mistake they made was they laughed at him. They were laughing at him. And he was much smaller than they were. So they're laughing. And then one of them says, "Well, he doesn't have the wallet, let's go." Tom Lincoln. And they turn to go, and Leon Easterling comes in and stabs Tom Lincoln in the stomach. The Harvard boys say, "Let's get the hell out of here." And Tom Lincoln can run. So they all run back to this alley. So this alley is off Boylston Street, and I'm just going to go forward for a second, and it's just to the very right of the Liberty Tree Plaza. So it would be very at the right of this building. That used to be the Silver Slipper. So they're in this alley. They run back. Andy Puopolo still isn't there yet, right? So the Harvard boys get into the van, all of them but one. 3 black guys follow them, and one guy in the cranberry jacket, who is the mystery, because no one can figure out what race he is, Some witnesses say he is black, some say he's white, some say he's Hispanic. And he pulls the linebacker out, I think, by his tie and starts beating him against the van, the Harvard van. And this is what Andy Puopolo now arrives. He heard the ruckus, he saw his teammates run, and he comes to the alley to see what's going on, and he sees his teammate being pummeled against the side of the van, and at this point, all the other Harvard football players are inside, so he doesn't have any help. So he runs in to help. The man in the cranberry jacket, somebody else, before he can get there, somebody else gets the linebacker back into the van, and while they're doing it, they push the man in the cranberry jacket, and you can't tell, but this is an incline that goes down. He tumbles down, he disappears. The police never find him. They can never identify him. No one has ever said his name. So Danny Puopolo told me he thought that maybe he was Italian. Maybe he was mob related, because maybe that's why nobody could figure out what race he was, and maybe that's why the cops never identified him or could figure out. And the prosecutors looked, because there's 2 trials. So nope, he's the mystery of this story. So Andy Puopolo gets into a fight with Eddie Soros, and they circle the van, and as they're fighting, Leon Easterling jumps over Soros and stabs Andy Puopolo up through the abdomen. Another teammate who's just arrived sees Andy, and he pulls him away, and they are actually in retreat. They are on the street, and Easterling comes, and Andy's okay. Easterling comes, and he stabs him again through the stomach, and they estimate 6 inches up into his heart. Cops arrive, like almost instantly. They arrest the three suspects, who were Leon Easterling, the guy who actually did the stabbing, Eddie Soros, who'd been in a fist fight with him, and Richard Allen, who was there, was the third guy, but he never actually touches anybody. But they all get arrested, and the cops take Andy to Tufts, New England, which is luckily minutes away. And when they get when he gets to the hospital, he's dead on arrival, but they are able to restart his heart. And when they restart his heart, I think they shine a light in his eye, and they see his pupils dilate. And in the morning, they do surgery on him to stitch him up. The prognosis is good. They think it's a miracle, and he's going to make it. And this is the news that gets out. This is the news that's reported by the cops, who are in desperate need of some good PR, given the report the week before saying they were all corrupt. Or get a lot of credit for quick action, getting him to, getting the suspects and getting him to the hospital and saving his life. So, but by the time this is Andy Puopolo. This is taken in 1976 for his medical school applications. He's 20 here, so this is only taken a few months before the stabbing. So he's taken to Tufts, and after the happy prognosis that goes out to the news, by the time his family was there all night, they told him to leave and get something to eat. They leave for about 2 hours. By the time they come back, the news isn't so good. Andy is seizing. He's in the ICU, but the hospital gives him this. I think it's probably the floor. I was up there. I think it's the one with the shades drawn. It's called the solarium, and it's like a nice lobby kind of waiting room that's offered to the family. So for the next month, that solarium will be mobbed. Everybody in the city councilors come by. Ted Kennedy sends a letter of support. The Pope sends a blessed medal from Rome. They're famous priests at this time. There's a healing priest. He comes by. Strangers send money in envelopes to the family, even though the family didn't ask for money. Strangers wander up to pray. Some psychics came to tell the family that he was definitely going to be fine. It's a madhouse. And during this time, everything is being reported. And the whole city is really rooting for his recovery. Here's a young man who a young college kid, and at first it looks like there's a miracle. So everybody's hoping for the miracle. But the miracle is temporary. He never wakes from his coma, and he dies on December 17th, still on life support. Okay, so these are the three defendants, left to right. This is a sketch, court sketch at WGBH. So on the left to right, that's Richard Allen on the left, and the middle is Edward Soares, and the right is Leon Easterling. Richard Allen, I think, is about 36 years old. Soares is, I think, 33, and Leon Easterling is 41. They are all charged equally with murder in the first degree. Okay, so less than 3 months later, in March 1977, the murder trial, just think about that, 3 months after he dies, they have the murder trial. That's like unheard of today. It was even unheard of then. It's rushed to the top of the docket under the major violations division. So I want to talk a little bit about joint venture, because you ask, how can 3 people be charged with murder when only one person stabbed him to death? So joint venture is like the felony murder rule. This is, the state provision. It's, with the guy who is driving the getaway car. If the bank robber goes in and he happens to shoot somebody while he's robbing the bank, the getaway guy is as equally as guilty because he was in on the scheme. So the prosecutor, who is Tom Mundy, who I don't know if anybody here knows of him. He passed away early, but he was considered the most brilliant prosecutor, even by defense attorneys I talked to who hated him. He's saying he's making 2 arguments, and they're kind of, one is that all 3 of these men were protectors working for the prostitute who stole the wallet for a cut of it. So that's one of his arguments that he'll make. And the second is joint venture is a very complicated legal concept, in that it says if the other 2 guys saw him use that knife on Tom Lincoln up at the T-stop, and then they go with him after the Harvard football players, knowing he has a knife and he will use it, then a jury could assume that they knew what he was doing, and thus they're guilty. Even if, like Edward Soares, you can make the argument because he was in a fist fight with him, and perhaps some of those blows landed on Puopolo's head. And Richard Allen is a big guy, so the argument was he's there offering protection, even though he doesn't touch anybody. So that's joint venture, which is pretty complicated, I think. All right, so all 3 men are convicted of murder in the first degree. Okay, so in March 1979, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, so obviously the defense appeals, and in March 1979, which is 2 years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rules that the prosecution's use of peremptory challenges was discriminatory, and they set aside the verdict. So, let me go back. So, what they said was that, and this is really hard for the family, because the defense argues that there's not enough evidence for joint venture. How can you say all 3 of these guys are in on it? But the high court says, no, we discard that argument. We've looked at the evidence, and we think there is enough evidence to convict all of them on joint venture. But the prosecutor used his peremptory challenges to eliminate 12 out of 13 potential black jurors. So peremptory challenges, for those of you who aren't lawyers, if you see a movie where each lawyer is like, they're trying to choose a jury, and each lawyer is getting rid of them based on who he thinks is going to help him or not, or they're And now they have jury consultants who come in and try to figure out which jurors to keep and not keep. But the main point is that the lawyers don't have to offer a reason. They could just say, nope, don't like him. Nope, don't like her. Nope, no, I just have a feeling. You know, they don't even have to say, they get the perjury challenges, they don't have to say why. So Mundy gets rid of 12 of 13 black jurors, figuring that black jurors are going to be sympathetic to the defendants. The defense, to be fair, gets rid of 17 potential jurors who have Italian last names, thinking they'll be too sympathetic to the victim. So this was a really common practice all across the nation, and in a primarily white country, it leads to all white juries. And even in a city, that has a 17% black population. So another problem is the jury pool tends to be white, very white to begin with, because at this time it's taken from voter registration, and at that time blacks didn't register to vote as frequently as whites did. So 2.5 years later, after the first trial, a new jury hears the same case, the same evidence, and reaches a nearly opposite verdict. Soares and Richie Allen go free, but I think what was most devastating to the family was that Leon Easterling is who actually admits on the stand that he stabbed him, only goes down for manslaughter. So he gets he'll be out of prison in 12 years. So let's see. Okay. So the positive thing about the Puopolo appeal is it changes the way juries are selected, preventing lawyers on both sides from striking potential jurors based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or ethnic identity. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1986 Batson decision will eventually adopt the same parameters established by the Massachusetts High Court in this, they call it the Soares decision. And it's not perfect, believe me. Lawyers can still try to get around it, but in Massachusetts particularly, it really does lead to a fairer selection of jurors that represent the community a little bit better. All right, so the Puopolo murder is also credited as being the beginning of the end of the combat zone. So obviously it takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight, but after the murder, the city is really determined to, does everything it can to make the adult entertainment business hard to do in Boston. And Ray Flynn, who will become mayor shortly, I think he becomes mayor in 81 or 82. But the day after Andy Puopolo was stabbed, he goes to the combat zone and stands on it with a petition to shut it down. I don't know if you guys know much about Ray Flynn. Was a basketball player, a really good basketball player. I think he played pro. He had coached Andy Puopolo in his youth, and he also goes on to be ambassador of Rome. So he's got other reasons not to like adult entertainment districts, but he was really galvanized by the murder of Andrew Puopolo. And so today, it takes a while though. Really need the advent of the VCR and the rising property values in Boston to put the final nails in the coffin. But so further down LaGrange Street, this is where on Saturday night used to be clogged with prostitutes and muggers and pickpockets. Another luxury condominium is rising. This is taken by my friend and writing partner Barbara Shapiro from another luxury condominium in the combat zone, which is the Ritz-Carlton, the Ritz. So in the North End, a park remains as a tribute to Andy Puopolo, who died trying to save a teammate. So this park, which is on Commercial Street, it's right on the water. It's the park that he grew up playing youth sports. And after he died, the neighborhood got together, and they got this park dedicated to him, and that it remains to this day. And when they grew up, playing sports. The city was such that you couldn't go there if you were Irish, let alone if you were black, right? I mean, the city was so segregated by ethnic and racial lines. And today, if you go there, you'll see, you'll see youth athletes of all races and all identities playing there. So that's some progress. So I am going to open it up to questions now, and I'll answer anything you want to know.
There's a microphone if anyone wants it.
Someone's going to ask you a question, right?
Yes.
Question. What caused you to write this book?
So when I finished my last murder mystery, which was in 2008, I was a little bit tired of making up bad things for people to do. And I was said to, like anyone who would listen, that I was looking for a story that needed to be told. And I said that enough that a friend of mine, or kind of a mutual friend, said, Danny Puopolo is looking for a screenwriter. And I said, why is Danny Puopolo looking for a screenwriter? And he said, do you remember that murder? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he's working with a director and he needs a screenwriter. Do you write screenplays? And I said, well, I have written a screenplay. I've never sold a screenplay, and I'm not sure it was actually a very good screenplay, but I have written them. So I got together with Danny, who was working with a Hollywood director at the time, and I agreed to write the screenplay on spec. But I know that these things, Hollywood, it takes millions and millions and probably billions of dollars now to make a movie, and I know that most of them don't get made. So I said, and on spec means I don't get paid unless it becomes a movie. So I said, I'll do this if I have the right, to write the book, and I have to write the book. I'm a journalist, so I have to write the story as I see it. And I kind of gave you a timeline of what happened, but the book is much more complex. It goes into a lot of what's going on in the city at the time, the things that I think influence the juries. And Danny didn't really agree with the way I saw the book, but he honored the agreement. So that's how I got involved in this project. Anybody else?
Sort of unrelated, I guess. I was in college in Boston at this time, so I remember this really well. But I was just curious, and you may not know, but I don't remember anything about the police corruption. Did anything come of that? Because it kind of mirrors what's going on today.
Yeah. So what DeGrazia did was he didn't name names of the police, but yeah. So there was so much crime in the combat zone. So DeGrazia kind of drops this report. On a day the Mayor White is gone, and then he leaves for a new job in Maryland. But the new Commissioner Joseph, I think Joseph Jordan. What is it?
Joseph Jordan.
Yeah, Joseph Jordan. He comes in, he increases the presence, and also he removes a lot of these cops. I think he kind of, he can't fire people, but he moves them around. And by the next spring, I think, the arrest rates are up, crime is down. He really does a tremendous job in the combat zone is going to be problematic for years, but it was so bad in '76. He does a great job, I think, of cleaning it up. So they did respond to the report, and some of the individual stories are just horrendous. I think a couple of cops went down. One of the things they did was they would alert the mob in advance of their own investigations. They would sleep with the prostitutes and then hold it over their head. And one instance is one report is they take two black prostitutes they just had sex with, and then they drop them off in Southie. They push them out of the door and beat the horn so everybody in Southie knows there's two black women there, so they'll get beat up. The things in the report are really disgusting. They do, they do clean it up with combat zone. I don't know as far as the city. I don't know, because they, you can't fire people, a couple people I think, but he can't fire all of them, but he kind of moves the pieces around. So they're not all concentrated in the combat zone. Anybody else?
I was wondering how long it took you to write the book.
Okay, so Dan knows this. So this project, I began this project 12 years ago. First, I probably spent a year and a half on the screenplay. Then I did a book proposal, and initially I couldn't sell the book proposal, and I knew how much work it was going to be to do this book, and even then I didn't know the half of it. But so I said no, I wasn't going to write it on spec. And then 5 years later, one of the publishers who'd rejected emailed me and said, we want to go forward with this project at this time. So 5 years later, I picked up the project again. I wrote it. I got a small advance. And then when I delivered it, the manuscript on deadline, the publisher, which was University Press of New England, announced 3 weeks later that it was going out of business. So then it took me a while to get it to the UMass Press, Brightleaf, and here I am. But it was a 12-year process. Yes?
Was there much difference in the press coverage from the first trial to the second?
Yes. So the press, there are more reporters there at the first trial. At the first trial, I think it's really about the combat zone. There's so much outrage about the combat zone. There's so much energy in the city and to close down that I think it's pretty easy to get, or relatively easy. I mean, Mundy put on a very good case. It's easy to get 3 convictions because everybody is outraged about the combat zone. They had to go through a jury pool of 182 potential jurors to find 13 who said, no, I'm not, no, the publicity hasn't made me already a decision. Also at this time, this is the second year, so the beginning of the 3rd year of busing. So this is the year that, 76 was the year that they started, Southie was first, now they're in Charlestown. And the city is just erupted in violence. Like it's the racial violence is unimaginable. I mean, from today's standards, it's like they don't start keeping track until 1978. And when they do, it's 604 incidences in a single year. And it was probably more in 76. So, and the white neighborhoods are pissed off. Their kids are being, are being bussed into neighborhoods that they think are dangerous, and they feel, they've been fighting this forever and they lost. So, Henry Owens, who represented Richie Allen, said they weren't like, they weren't. It was hard to find somebody who cared about the rights of a black defendant. So it was primed. It was primed for a conviction, and then 3 weeks before the second trial, Darrell Williams was shot by 3 white kids from a rooftop while he was playing football at Charlestown and on the field in a football game. And so now the outrage shifts, and also the book is about all the other things that happened in that 2.5 years. There are black victims that do not get the justice they deserve. There's a Globe spotlight series that says that black defendants or when they're convicted, they serve much more time for the same crime as white defendants. So there's a lot in that 2.5 years changes, and in that 2.5 years, I think Boston gets really sick of the white Boston gets sick of the protests. They get sick of being angry. Louise Day Hicks is voted out. Pixie Palladino is voted out. I think it's named John Brown, the first black school committee man, is elected. He's up. Bryant, yeah. So he's not the first one ever, but he's the first one in a long time.
First chair.
Yeah. So the city changes, and in some ways, I think that the trials actually kind of reflect. Sometimes I think they're a little bit more about the city than they are about the crime, because the second trial where they all get off, when you look at I've read the transcripts to both of these trials, and the news coverage, And the news coverage really looks like they're all, going down. Like there's so many, in the defense's testimony, there are so many holes. They completely contradict each other, So when you look at the news coverage, it looks like they're going to get convicted again, and they don't. So Norman Zalkind represented Easterling, and they asked him, "Do you think the Darrell Williams shooting had an effect on the jury?" And he says, "Sure didn't hurt." So, and he told me he thinks that the publicity always has a huge impact, and even before the trial, particularly, and even during the trial, and that jurors, even when they say that they're not, watching the news or listening, often are. So I kind of think the only way you can get a more neutral jury is if you change the venue, and that almost never happens. Yes?
Was it hard for you to write about these defendants, right, in terms of the crime and then the process of justice? How did you reconcile those two opposite feelings about the incident?
Well, what I tried to do is I tried to reach out to their families because I wanted to know them and I wanted to know their histories and as people because, it was a time of great poverty. And Leon Easterling actually, when he was still alive, offered to speak to me. He found me that I was writing about the book. He was out of prison, but he wanted me to pay him, which, journalists don't do. So and then he passed away like 2 years later. So, but his wife was going to talk to me. I found her in New Hampshire, and we were all set to meet. And then the family, I think, put pressure on her not to speak to me. So what I did was I would hunt people down. I found a lot of people who knew them, in the combat zone, friends. I found some people who knew Leon Easterling when he lived in Philadelphia, which was before he came back to the combat zone. So I tried to understand them as people, and I spoke to their lawyers, and their lawyers gave me, their defense. So, I don't, I have a problem. If I was a juror, I would have a problem with joint venture. I would have a problem with getting inside someone's head and deciding intent. I would have no problem convicting Leon Easterling, but I would have problems with Richie Allen and Edward Soares. Maybe Edward Soares for assault and battery or manslaughter, but I would have a hard time convicting. Yes.
Do you know what happened to the other two?
I think Edward Soares is my favorite of the defendants that I don't know, because there's an incident in the book where he finds he runs one of Harvard and he apologizes for the night. So Edward Soares was very religious. From all accounts, he never got in any trouble again. He sold jewelry in at Downtown Crossing outside of Filene's for many years. They all died pretty young. Rich Allen, I'm not sure. I didn't put this in the book because I couldn't verify it, but I have heard that he died of an overdose.
He died of what?
Of an overdose?
No.
AIDS? Yeah.
He was in Lemuel Shattuck Hospital.
They what?
He was in Lemuel Shattuck Hospital.
Okay, yeah.
With HIV.
Yep. All right, so at one point...
And we were like this.
Oh, really? Okay, so at one point, Andy Puopolo, this is before Leon Easterling contacted me, had been told that Leon Easterling died of AIDS, and I think they just got confused and that it was Richie Allen. So.
Are you familiar with the Lemuel Shattuck Hospital?
That's one in Natick? No. Where?
It's in Franklin Park.
Oh, okay.
And I believe it's part of the city. I believe the city owns it for indigent people. Plus, politicians also use it.
What year did he? I think I have the year that he died. The year that he died. I think I have it in the book. Yeah. I wish I'd met you before I wish I knew you before I wrote the book. I was desperate to find people who knew Richard Allen.
Yeah, I used him as an enforcer.
Ah, okay.
Had a lot of years in the combat zone.
Ah, okay. All right, so he worked as a bouncer, right? And
Died of AIDS complications.
okay.
He was a needle user.
Oh, okay. Anybody else have questions?
You made the decision to go ahead with that joint venture. It seemed to be a flaw. Why would they pursue that?
I think, well, so Monday, so the Suffolk District Attorney at the time was Garrett Byrne, and he had hated the combat zone for a long time. So I think it was the outrage over the combat zone. I think it was all together with the outrage over the combat zone to make sure 3 people went down for this murder. But joint venture is used, like even defense attorneys will tell you that joint venture is valid in certain circumstances. But, you know, it's something that starts like this as a fight, you know, it's a little bit more problematic. But I assume that it was probably Tom Mundy's decision approved by the district attorney. And 3 people had to go down for this heinous murder. And that's what they went with. Like, I feel like if they had said to the Puopolo family, justice is Leon Easterling goes down, you know, that's justice. If he goes to life imprisonment, then they would have been happy with that. But they were told from the beginning that there's no justice unless all 3 of them go down. And I think that's true with so victims' families, you know, their loved one is dead and they want to still do something for their loved one, and what they want is to get them justice. And they want the maximum justice. And if it's less than the maximum, that says somehow the victim is at fault somehow. And that's how they look at it. And in this particular story, it's really terrible because even to this day, when I was mentioning I do the book, someone will say, oh yeah, that was that guy who got killed trying to, you know, buy sex in the combat zone. And that happens, and I'll say, no, he wasn't anywhere near the prostitute. He really went and saved, but the family hears this all the time. You know, it's not only did they lose their loved one, but it's like people want there to be a reason for the person who get murdered so that it can't happen to them. That's like a very natural instinct. You know, oh, well, he was in the combat zone. Why would anybody go in the combat zone? So it kind of shifts the blame to the victim, and then the family feels awful because they are like reeling. They're reeling from the murder. They're reeling from the criminal justice system where they relive it. They're reeling from the appeal and the press, and you know, it's really they've got, you know, it's horrible. Someone had their hand raised.
That's a good follow-up. Is that one of the reasons why you dedicated the book to the Andy Puopolo?
Yeah, and also one of the subplots in here is Danny Puopolo's struggle with revenge and the instinct for revenge, because you know at the time because Andy was from the North End, and because the mob owned 40% of the combat zone, they lost a lot of money because police shut things down for a few months afterwards. So there were rumors that there was never going to be a trial, that they were going to be, the 3 defendants were going to be murdered in prison. And some of those rumors were true. So, but to get back to your question, I think that Danny's story shows you a lot about what kids in the city are dealing with. You know, when you see the gang killing each other, you know, these are young kids. They see their friend or their brother murdered on the street, and the very natural instinct is for revenge, and it creates a cycle of revenge. So I think that, you know, Danny's story helped me at least understand a lot of the violence I see in the inner city. And, you know, I think that young kids who witness murder really need treatment, you know, and that can help a lot. Anybody else have a question? No? Yeah.
I want to ask this question. Why do you think that, by the way, I should say, I represented Eddie Swords at the second trial. I'm Andy Good.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, have a mask on. So you
Yeah, I can't see, yeah.
There are a couple things that I would say in response to your talk. The first is that there are significant differences between the first trial and the second. The most important was a different judge. The first judge was James Roy, R-O-Y, who was a horrendous bigot. And so it wasn't an accident that he stacked the jury with white people, and was what he did routinely. So, and the SJC knew who James Roy was and what he was about. So a lot of the result in the appeal was a function of understanding that the court needed to stop what Roy and other members of the court were doing in jury selection. It wasn't just Roy. There were lots of, this was going on for years, especially in cross-racial cases like this one. So that didn't happen at the second trial because we had a real judge. The second thing is that this whole robber board theory, meaning that was a euphemism for trying to characterize the three black guys as somehow linked to robber boards. And they never established even any evidence that there was any relationship, that any of these guys had any relationship with any of these women. There was just zero evidence of that.
There was some evidence that you thwarted and that wasn't heard at the trial. They had women who were willing to testify, and they didn't.
They didn't testify, and the reason they didn't testify is that they weren't assured that they would not be prosecuted, and so they naturally refused to testify. But the bottom line is, the evidence in the case was that there was no link. The only evidence about Eddie Soar's activity was that he was selling jewelry in the combat zone, and that was it. So, I guess the bottom line of the way I see this case, I've always seen it, was that Tom Mundy, who was as bad as Roy on race, was perfectly willing to characterize these three guys as somehow linked to prostitutes because they were in the combat zone to begin with. So they were sort of racially out of place. Why are you there if you're not doing this? Right? That's the first, I remember specifically him telling me in the hallway, acts like a duck, walks like a duck, he's a duck. So, he just was willing to use his own stigmatization of black people to try to convict them. And the jury saw through it. The jury acquitted Leon Easterling of all charges related to stabbing Thomas Lincoln, even though he admitted stabbing him.
Yeah,
self-defense.
that's puzzling.
Well, it's not troubling to me. It was a fight, okay? And Lincoln admitted that this is a horrendous fight, and there was self-defense for Easterling, and he was acquitted, even though he admitted he stabbed the kid. Now, that's what juries are supposed to do in a self-defense case, and they did it. And then they reached manslaughter for the same reason. So, I don't think it's fair or accurate, and more importantly, to say that justice wasn't served here. I think it was. I think the jury pretty much got it right. Richie Allen, they never connected Richie Allen with anything that happened there. This huge guy who you would have thought would have been sort of characterized as the most dangerous because he was enormous. I mean, he was, he would fill a doorway. He was a big, big guy, big, strong guy. But they never connected him to anything. And you're right that there was this mystery guy, and nobody knew who the hell he was, and nobody does now, as far as I know. I've never heard anybody say who he was or what he did, or it was just this phantom character. So overall, I think that you mentioned late in your talk the race
dimension of what was going on in the city at that time around the schools and race, I don't think you can overstate the racial tension that the case raised. That this was a racially polarized city at that time, even 5 years after 75 when the busing really started. By the second trial in 79, it was still hot as hell. And that was also a huge factor here in how the whole case was presented. You're right, the press was convicted, all of them, throughout. So, and the other thing is the jury was not affected by the publicity, I don't think, because they were locked up.
Well, there are 3 defense attorneys, and they disagree. So,
okay. Well, the fact is they were locked up. Nobody can dispute that. We tried the case from the day after Labor Day to the night before Thanksgiving. And the jury was in a hotel room all that time.
right, but they weren't locked up prior to that. I mean, a lot of this stuff was going on right before they were
But
sequestered.
I'm saying once the trial started, the jury was under the control of the court. They didn't get newspapers, they didn't get television, they didn't get anything. Okay, so I don't think that the publicity had anything to do with how the jury behaved, at least during the trial. So anyway, that's my view.
Anybody else?
Do you know what the jury makeup was, the racial makeup
Yes.
of both trials?
Yeah, so in the first trial, it was 11 whites and 1 black man who was the foreman. And in the second trial, it's not like there's only 3 blacks in the second trial, 3 black jurors. So it's not, it's not like, but at least there's some representation, so. Yeah.
I wonder what changes you saw at the time, or in your research you saw at the combat zone as a policy after this high-profile case. We're all familiar with New York, how that kind of changed.
So immediately after, the cops swarm the combat zone. I mean, they say they were guarding the combat zone like the Berlin Wall. Their prostitutes are pushed out into other neighborhoods, and other neighborhoods are getting upset. They had been investigating, the Suffolk County District Attorney had been investigating the combat zone anyway, so they immediately begin on, I think there's an FBI probe on the mob ownership of the clubs. They start to take these clubs for violations of liquor license. They start shutting some of them down. I mean, some of them shut down and appeal and come back, but they start shutting down clubs. The main thing is the police presence. They said, I don't know, like months later, I think a Globe reporter came in and did a piece, and he would be in the clubs and nobody would be there, So it really shut down business. I would say probably at least 4 or 5 months, because the thing about this story was it got national. I mean, 300 newspapers across the country covered this story, as far away as the Stars and Stripes in Japan. This was a big story, mostly because pornography and adult was very controversial at the time. And Boston had, even though when it created the combat center, it was trying to restrict it, that was seen as license. So the city that banned everything from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass to I Am Curious Yellow is now what was seen as establishing a 4-block area of sin. And the truth is, because when they established it, they promised cleaning up the area and all sorts of police patrol. That didn't happen, and it was actually the opposite. So things just got really worse.
The morality piece is what I wonder, because by shutting off a geography, you're shutting off like a piece of humanity that you want to deny.
Yeah.
Or as a conservative, if you will, this is not a part of me.
Yeah.
And so therefore I can do it by shutting out a geography. So that's kind of a piece that I wonder, I'm curious.
Yeah, morality plays a huge role in this early on. And because it's coupled with crime and corruption, so But at the time, there were these sadomasochistic films being released, where the snuff films, they called them. So people were freaked out over that. They were freaked out over something, like in those days, you went to the movies. They were shown in movies. They were upset about what they called the new social acceptability of pornography. I think, was it Brandeis had somebody on their board, the guy who started Penthouse. And so there was this concern that there was growing acceptance of this. And when you established a combat zone, you were saying it was okay. And when 2 Harvard football players got stabbed, see, you were wrong, Boston. That's what it was about. And that's why it got so much coverage, outside of Boston. Anybody else? Okay, yeah.
I was a college student too around that time and had just moved here from the South. When I saw the name Puopolo, that, it started to bounce in my brain. I remembered so much publicity about it, but I never really knew the background story because I didn't have time to read Globe every day.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is enlightening. One of the things that I wonder about just in recent time, did your research take you into Chinatown and how the Chinatown residents were affected by the fact that the combat zone was allowed to be?
Yeah, just peripherally though, because I didn't have a lot of time to do this book. But I know that Chinatown got offered like all sorts of things that didn't happen. Like I think they got offered a new housing development that never came to go along with the approval. Yeah. But Chinatown pretty much got screwed early on in this, and then became very, I think, instrumental in pressuring it to get smaller and smaller. So I think Chinatown finds finally gets a voice in this, but not early on. Maybe like the late 70s. Early on, they kind of get steamrolled, I think. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. And I should say my website is www.janbrogan.com if you're looking for more information about the book. And I hope you buy it, and I hope you read it, and I hope you like it.